I saw an article earlier in the New York Times this week about the weird world of haunted eBay. There was a writer for the Times that was exploring eBay one night a couple of years ago and noticed how many haunted listings there were. Items like dolls and combs, rings and teddy bears, and ships in a bottle. And he wound up going the entire night looking for anything on eBay that was listed as haunted, and just that one evening found 50 different items that were up for sale. Lots of them had a description such as buyer beware, you don't know what this will bring into your home, and stories of what unexpected or unexplained things happened because the seller had this haunted item in the house. And the article went on to talk about how some of the buyers wrote back, you know, I've had this haunted doll for 2 hours and I've not noticed anything strange going on just yet. I think this is misleading, and the seller would write back, just give it time. It's an interesting time of year where we hear these sorts of stories, whether it's from eBay or houses. A lot of TV shows nowadays talk about unexplained happenings, creepy things that take place that we just don't seem to have any good explanation for why these things happen. And one of my favorite things about the Methodist tradition is that there are actually some relatively unknown ghost stories that go all the way back, in fact, to John Wesley. In some of his journals, he would write about his own experiences with creepy happenings, with things that he couldn't quite explain or fully figure out why it happened. And one of my favorite stories that he wrote about was his childhood experience with a poltergeist by the name of Old Jeffrey. Now Wesley wrote in his journals that when he was a child growing up, there was one December evening where suddenly a poltergeist showed up in the old Epworth rectory where his family lived during his childhood. Now the poltergeist, if you're unfamiliar with ghost terminology, is usually some sort of spirit that creates a lot of disturbances, loud bangings, tosses things around the house. Not necessarily a very friendly spirit. You wouldn't consider this to be Casper the Friendly Ghost by any means. But John recounted, and in fact his entire family at some point recounted in their writings, their own experiences with Old Jeffrey. And it started when some of the household staff were sitting in the dining room and heard a knocking at the door. Well, they go to open the door and nobody's there, so they sit back down, and again they hear a knocking on the door. They keep getting up and there's nobody there, but the knocking happens, and then they hear, in fact, a loud horn being blown throughout the house that pierces their ears. The next night comes, and now the kids begin to hear and experience this poltergeist for themselves. They hear as well the knocking throughout the house. They hear the horn being blown, the sound of wood being sawed, and then they begin to see the furniture move around the house. And in fact, Wesley's own sister was in her bed when the bed was slowly raised up into the air, and they couldn't make sense of it. Well, their mother, Susanna, initially didn't believe what the kids were telling them, that there was something in the house with them, but then she too had her own experience with Old Jeffrey, to the point that she stood in a room and threatened the ghost and said, "You better not mess with my evening prayer time." Now, she said this probably in more better Old English than I just used, but the gist was, don't mess with my evening prayers. I don't know if Old Jeffrey was scared of her or what might happen if he messed with her prayer time, but he never intervened or caused any strange happenings when she prayed. Well, John's father began to rebuke the children for telling these tall tales, that nothing was going on in the house, until one evening he himself was opening the door to his study when the door slammed shut in his face, and he too heard knockings going on. So when you have a poltergeist who is living in your house, the natural thing to do is to go get a dog, right? But Wesley's decided the best way to counter this poltergeist was to get a large mastiff to come home and to scare the ghosts away and protect the household. But wouldn't you know it, the first time Old Jeffrey came knocking through the house, the dog ran and hid under the table, terrified by the ghost. So for 8 long weeks, the Wesleys dealt with old Jeffrey visiting them at all times during the evening until one late January day, as quickly and mysteriously as old Jeffrey had appeared, he stopped coming by, and they never heard from him again. Now, whether that story sends shivers up your spine or you find yourself approaching it with a healthy dose of skepticism, we have all of these different stories throughout human history of things that can't seem to defy our explanations. But I think these stories point to reality that there are things in our lives that we don't always understand, that we don't seem to have a natural reason to explain why they occur or can't make sense of why they take place. Now, we have been looking at ghost stories from around different cultures over the past couple of weeks, and we've been looking at ghost stories in our own biblical tradition. And I think that is what our stories also point us to, is that there are these things that don't always make sense. And that's particularly true in the story that we heard read for us this morning from the book of Daniel. Now, this isn't a story that I think we typically hear read aloud in worship. We most often encounter Daniel in Sunday school classes, if at all. But this story, when you look at it, doesn't quite make sense. So let's review the story, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. So this story from Daniel takes place in Babylon, where Belshazzar is king. And particularly in this period of Babylonian history, the Israelites are living in the city as an exiled community. Belshazzar is descended from the line of King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the one who had come in and sacked Jerusalem and sent many of the Israelites to live in exile in Babylon. Now, Belshazzar wasn't necessarily the king. His father was still king, but he would fill in for his father when he was out of town or away from the city. And so during that time, Belshazzar would like to remind people how great that he was. And so in this particular instance, he threw a party to share how great he was, how strong the kingdom of Babylon was, and to really drive the point home, he ordered that all of the gold and silver goblets that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem be brought into the party, so that way his guests could drink from them and admire how great of a person that he was. And when they come in, the people continue to celebrate, and the party goes on, and they're having a really good time. But suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Belshazzar notices something moving against the wall near where he is sitting. And as he looks over to see what is moving against the wall, he notices a hand. Now, this hand isn't attached to a body. There's no owner for it, but it is there hanging in the air and slowly tracing out and writing words on the wall. Now, I love the way that the Bible translates this particular part of the passage, where his face goes pale and his knees begin to shake. It's a really nice way of saying he is absolutely terrified out of his mind to see this hand that's writing there on the wall. And when there's something strange that's going on in your neighborhood, who are you going to call? Ghostbusters, right. He calls in the Babylonian Ghostbusters. He invites enchanters and diviners and wise men, anybody he can think of, to come in and try and get to the bottom of this mystery of what is this hand doing, writing on the wall, and what is this message that is being left there. And he promises this really big reward. Whoever can figure out this writing is going to be elevated to third in the kingdom, to a position of power and prestige and honor for helping to solve this mystery. But nobody can figure it out. People, person after person comes in, looks at the message, and they're stumped. They can't understand what it says or why this took place. And it's in the midst of this that the queen, in fact, remembers Daniel, who had been so instrumental to King Nebuchadnezzar, to helping him understand different things, that she says, bring him in to see if he can read the message. Now Daniel, when he arrives on the scene in the story, is immediately set apart from the king. The king, who was trying to show how great he was, stands in contrast because Daniel doesn't want the reward, but he's still willing to read the message that is on the wall. And here the message is in fact a pun. I don't know if you know, but the Hebrew Bible is full of puns, and that is what the hand wrote upon the wall. These words are Aramaic for different types of coins and numerical ways of counting things. They're written on the wall in descending order, and so Daniel interprets the message to say that God has pronounced a judgment upon Belshazzar, that his days are numbered, growing shorter, and that the kingdom will be given over to the Persians. And indeed, if we were to read on further in Daniel, that is what happens. In a matter of days, the Persians take over the Babylonian kingdom, and the Israelites, who had been living in exile for almost 70 years, are given permission by the Persians to go back home, to rebuild the temple, and to start anew. Daniel is a real interesting book. It's one of the latest books to be written in the Hebrew Bible. And often if we hear the stories at all, stories like this writing on the wall passage, or Daniel in the lion's den, or the fiery furnace, we hear about them in Sunday school, and the other part of the book has a lot of apocalyptic imagery. It doesn't always make sense when we look at it on first glance. But it's really part of an important period of Israelite history where they were living in exile in Babylon. And that whole period where they watched their city fall, where they were living in a strange land, caused a lot of turmoil and inner wrestling for the Israelites. Some books of the Bible, like Lamentations, really capture that particular struggle as they tried to make sense. Why did this happen to them in the first place? Why did the city fall? Why were they living in exile? And as they began to ask those questions, it led to even harder questions. Where was God in the midst of this situation? Did we do something to make this happen? If there was a reason for this, then why would God make us experience this particular thing? So stories like we see in the book of Daniel were stories that were told to try and make sense of these bigger questions, to really try and explore the mystery behind why they were experiencing these particular conditions. I think today, even though we are not experiencing by any means what the Israelites lived through during that time, we ask similar questions of our own. Some of you would identify yourselves as living in the midst of difficult circumstances, and as we acknowledged in last week's sermon, life is not easy sailing. And there comes times where we find ourselves in the midst of situations that seem greater than the strength that we have or the resources that we have. We find ourselves encountering things that make us afraid, or we look at the world around us and see it filled with injustices, and we wrestle with, why do these things take place? What is our role in these situations? And particularly, I think the question that we can often struggle with is, where is God in the midst of difficult and troubling circumstances? And sometimes just wrestling with those questions and the lack of clarity in them can seem frightening in and of itself. Earlier this year, I came across a book by Kate Bowler with the title, "Everything Happens for a Reason, and Other Lies I've Loved." The title alone caught my eye, so I grabbed it and brought it home to read, because that's a phrase that I've heard often throughout my life. You know, well, everything happens for a reason. There must be some reason for why this is taking place. Sometimes it's a lesson, sometimes it's a way to benefit somebody else, or sometimes it's because of something that we did, but there's always a reason to explain everything that happens in our lives. And maybe for you, you find that phrase comforting, but just speaking for myself, I've wrestled a lot with that phrase because it leads me to ask some harder questions that I don't know the answers to. Because if everything happens for a reason, well, where is God in this? And why would God do something like that? And what does that say about me, and it just raises up questions that I find that I struggle with. So I got the book thinking that this would be a theological treatise explaining what the reason was for everything, but instead it's a memoir written by Kate, sharing about a time in her life where she received a call that she had an incurable diagnosis, and her whole life was thrown upside down, and she found herself wrestling with those same questions. Where was God in the midst of going on, and what was the reason for this, or was there even a reason for why she would receive such a phone call or news? And as she wrestled with her own mortality, as she wrestled with her fear and with her grief, she found that there were some other things that she was finding in the midst of her journey that also didn't quite make sense. She said whenever she found that she should be most afraid, she felt the very real presence of love. She found love through the friends and the family members who would come and sit beside her in her hospital bed and just listen to her or be there with her. She felt love when she received cards and prayers from those who were thinking of her. She found love in the joy of seeing her family experience time together. And she found that love remained even when she found herself feeling further away from some of those situations. That love left an imprint on her heart. She writes towards the end of the book, "This is all I have learned about living here, plodding along and finding God. My well-laid plans are no longer my foundation. I can only hope that my dreams, my actions, my hopes are leaving a trail for my son and my husband. So whichever way the path turns, all they will find is love." Friends, there is no situation in our lives that escapes God. There is no situation that is excluded from God's love, and nothing we can find ourselves in, no experience that we go through is ever great enough to separate us from the love that we find in God. And that, I find, is the story that Scripture tells over and over again from beginning to end. That God created all things in goodness and love, and the hope and the final promise of the Bible is that all things will be taken up and reconciled and transformed by God's goodness and love. For the Israelites who found themselves living in exile, stories like they find in Daniel would have reminded them of that truth. It didn't change the difficult circumstances that they were in. It didn't take away the pain that they had experienced, but it surely would have reminded them that God's hand was in their particular situation, that God had not forgotten them, that God had not given up on them, and that God was leaving a trail, making a way through their trouble and difficulties that would lead them towards a greater love. And this, I think, is the writing on the wall. Unjust situations and difficult circumstances will not last forever. And no matter what we may find ourselves experiencing, we are not alone, because God is doing a new thing in our midst. I find that this is one of the hardest things our faith asks us to trust in and to believe in, but the signs are there. Even in the midst of difficult circumstances, there are moments of goodness. There are imprints of love. There are things that remind us that we are loved, that God is with us, and that there is a path that will lead us back to that love. Friends, whatever situation or circumstance you may find yourselves in at this time, or that you may find yourselves in the future, remember that God is always reaching out to you. God is always reaching out to us to offer us a hand and inviting us to trust that if God is with us, then God will see us through whatever it is that we face. Amen. Amen.